Stand up. Now. The words cut clean through the quiet of the park, sharp enough to turn heads without a single shout. Officer Daniel Brooks didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Authority sat heavy in his tone, in the straight line of his shoulders, in the polished badge catching the late afternoon sun. The metal flashed once, briefly blinding against the soft gold light that filtered through the maple trees. A few pigeons fluttered startled, then settled again near the bench. Samuel Carter didn't move. He sat exactly where he had been for the past hour, on the far edge of a weathered wooden bench facing the pond, a small paper cup of coffee resting beside him, its lid slightly tilted, steam long faded into the cooling air. His hands, thin and lined with age, rested loosely on his knees. The skin on them was dark and worn, like old leather that had seen too many seasons. A gentle breeze moved through the park, carrying the scent of grass and distant water, brushing softly against the collar of his coat. It was an old coat, the kind that had been mended more than once, threads barely holding in places, but clean. Always clean. Brooks stepped closer, boots pressing into the gravel path with a measured crunch, each step deliberate, each one narrowing the space between authority and quiet resistance. I said stand up, he repeated, slower this time, as if speaking to someone who simply hadn't understood the first time. Around them, the park continued in fragments, joggers passing at a distance, a mother calling to her child near the swings, the low murmur of water rippling against the edge of the pond. But closer in, within a few yards of the bench, something shifted. Conversation softened. Movement slowed. People noticed. Samuel's eyes lifted, not in defiance, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. He looked at Brooks the way one looks at a sudden storm on the horizon, aware, steady, accepting of its presence without surrendering to it. The sunlight touched the side of his face, tracing the lines carved there by decades of quiet endurance. He didn't reach for his coffee. Didn't adjust his coat. Didn't rise. The silence stretched, thin but unbroken. Brooks exhaled through his nose, a subtle tightening in his jaw, the kind that came from being ignored in a moment where obedience was expected. His gaze flicked briefly to the nearly empty bench, then back to the man in front of him, as if confirming something already decided long before he had spoken. A leaf drifted down between them, slow and unbothered, landing near Samuel's shoe. Samuel noticed it. His eyes dropped for just a second, following its gentle fall, then returned to the officer. Still calm. Still seated. The world did not rush him. And somehow, that made everything feel louder, the crunch of Brooks's stance, the faint clink of the badge, the distant echo of a siren blocks away. Brooks shifted his weight, the leather of his duty belt creaking softly, impatience beginning to edge into the corners of his posture. You can't stay here, he said, firmer now, though still controlled, still measured for anyone who might be watching. And they were watching. Not openly. Not boldly. But enough. Samuel's fingers moved slightly, just enough to brush against the side of the cup, steadying it before it tipped. A small gesture. Careful. Intentional. Then he looked back up again, meeting the officer's eyes with the same quiet steadiness. He didn't speak. Not yet. The breeze picked up again, lifting the edges of his coat, rustling the trees above like a soft whisper passing judgment on nothing and everything at once. And in that suspended moment, with sunlight fading inch by inch across the bench and the air holding its breath, the line between power and dignity stood perfectly still. Samuel Carter had learned a long time ago that stillness could speak louder than any raised voice. He did not rush his breath, did not tighten his jaw, did not let the weight of the moment bend his posture. Instead, he sat the way he always had, back straight but relaxed, shoulders easy, as if the bench beneath him had memorized the shape of his presence over years of quiet afternoons. This park was not just a place to sit. It was routine. It was memory. Every morning, just after 7, he would walk the same half-mile from his small apartment 3 blocks away, past the corner store with the flickering sign, past the brick church that rang its bell on Sundays, and into this stretch of green that felt like the last honest piece of the city. He always brought the same things. A paper cup of coffee, 2 sugars, no lid once it cooled. A small brown bag folded neatly at the top, filled with pieces of bread he saved from the night before. Nothing wasted. Nothing hurried. The pigeons knew him now. They gathered before he even sat down, small gray bodies shifting and circling with quiet expectation. He never fed them all at once. Just a few pieces at a time, letting them come and go, letting the moment stretch. It was not about feeding birds. It was about rhythm. About control over something gentle in a world that had rarely offered him much of it. His fingers moved again now, slow and deliberate, pressing lightly against the side of the cup to keep it steady as a faint ripple of wind passed through. The cardboard was slightly damp from the cooling coffee, soft at the edges, but he held it carefully, the way you hold something that still matters even when it is small. Across from him, the pond reflected the sky in broken pieces, sunlight scattering across the surface like glass. A child laughed somewhere behind him, high and bright, followed by the softer voice of a parent reminding them to stay close. Samuel heard it, absorbed it, but did not turn. He had spent a lifetime noticing without intruding, existing without demanding space. That was how you lasted. That was how you moved through places where you were not always welcomed, but never fully erased either. His coat shifted slightly as he adjusted his weight, the fabric brushing against the bench with a soft, worn sound. Beneath the sleeve, just visible for a moment as the cuff pulled back, a thin medical bracelet caught the light. The metal was scratched, dulled by time, but still intact. Still worn. He did not look at it. He did not need to. He knew it was there the way one knows the presence of a scar beneath clothing, something carried, not displayed. Officer Brooks remained standing in front of him, the distance between them unchanged but heavier now, filled with expectation that had not been met. The officer's shadow stretched across the ground, touching the edge of Samuel's shoes, a dark line drawn by authority that expected compliance. Samuel noticed that too. Not with fear, not with defiance, but with the quiet awareness of a man who had seen many lines drawn in his lifetime, some spoken, some silent, all meant to define where he was allowed to be. He did not cross it. He did not retreat from it either. He simply remained. The breeze moved again, softer this time, lifting a few loose crumbs from the ground where earlier pieces of bread had fallen. A pigeon stepped forward, cautious but trusting, pecking gently at the space near Samuel's feet. He watched it for a second, the smallest hint of warmth passing through his eyes, then lifted his gaze once more to meet the officer's. Calm. Present. Unmoved. And in that quiet continuity, it became clear that Samuel Carter was not just sitting on a bench. He was holding his ground in the only way he ever had, without force, without noise, but with a kind of dignity that refused to be displaced. Officer Daniel Brooks had been trained to read situations quickly, to assess, decide, and act before hesitation could take root, and in most cases that instinct had served him well, earning quiet nods from superiors and the kind of reputation that moved a career forward without needing to be spoken out loud. He stood now with that same trained posture, shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted, one hand resting near his belt not out of threat but out of habit, a position repeated so many times it had become second nature. The uniform fit him precisely, pressed lines sharp along his sleeves, the dark fabric clean and unwrinkled, a contrast to the softer, worn textures around him in the park. His badge caught the light again as he shifted, a small, controlled movement, but enough to send another flash of gold into the space between him and the man on the bench. Brooks was not old. Not yet seasoned in the quiet ways some officers became after decades on the force. He was still early enough in his career to believe that control came from clarity, that rules, once stated, should be followed without question, and that hesitation invited disorder. Today mattered to him more than most days. It was his first full shift assigned to this district alone, without a senior officer nearby to correct or redirect him. The briefing that morning had been brief but pointed. Keep the park clear. Maintain presence. Do not allow loitering to turn into problems. He had taken those words seriously, carrying them with him like a checklist running quietly in the back of his mind as he walked his route. When he first saw Samuel from across the path, sitting still for longer than the others who passed through, feeding birds, not moving on, something in Brooks had marked it immediately. Out of place. Not because of anything loud or obvious, but because stillness, in his experience, often signaled something that needed to be addressed. He had approached with purpose, each step reinforcing the authority he believed he was there to uphold. And yet now, standing within a few feet of the man, that certainty had begun to shift, not outwardly, not enough for anyone watching to notice, but internally, in the quiet space where expectation met reality and did not immediately align. The man had not argued, had not raised his voice, had not even refused in the way Brooks was used to, with defiance or sarcasm or challenge. He had simply remained. That stillness, that calm refusal to move without confrontation, created a different kind of tension, one Brooks had not been trained to manage with the same clarity. His eyes flicked briefly to the surroundings again, scanning faces, noting who lingered a second longer than necessary, who slowed their walk just enough to listen without appearing to watch. Perception mattered. Control was not only about action, but about how that action was seen. Brooks adjusted his stance again, feet planted firmly, widening just slightly, grounding himself in the role he understood. The breeze shifted his uniform subtly, fabric brushing against itself with a faint sound that felt louder than it should have in the quiet. He looked down for a fraction of a second, noticing the man's hands, steady despite their age, the careful way he held even the simplest things, as if nothing was ever taken for granted. Then his gaze moved higher, settling again on Samuel's face, searching for something he could define, something that would justify the next step, something that would restore the straightforward clarity he expected from the moment. Instead, what he found was composure. Not passive, not absent, but present in a way that did not yield. Brooks inhaled slowly, controlled, measured, the way he had been taught when situations required firmness without escalation. He was the authority here. That had not changed. And yet, as the seconds stretched and the man on the bench remained exactly where he was, the simplicity of that authority felt less certain than it had just moments before. Samuel Carter let the silence breathe for one more second before he finally moved, not to stand, not to comply, but to speak, and even then it was slow, measured, as if each word had to pass through years of careful restraint before it was allowed into the air. "I come here every morning," he said, his voice low and steady, shaped by age but not weakened by it, carrying just far enough to reach the officer without disturbing the rest of the park. He did not raise his chin, did not challenge. He simply spoke the truth the way he had lived it, plainly, without decoration. His fingers lifted from his knee and reached toward the small brown bag beside him, unfolding the top with quiet precision, the paper making a soft crackling sound that seemed almost too gentle for the tension sitting between them. He took a piece of bread, broke it in half, and dropped it near his feet. The pigeons responded immediately, stepping closer, their small movements calm, unafraid. "Been doing that for years," he added, almost as if he were finishing a thought rather than starting one. Brooks watched him, the action registering not as defiance in the usual sense, but as something harder to categorize, something that did not fit into the clean lines of compliance or resistance he had been trained to expect. "That is not the point," Brooks replied, his tone tightening slightly, the edges of control becoming more defined. "You cannot stay here like this." The word like hung in the air for a fraction too long, carrying more weight than the rest of the sentence, even if he did not intend it to. Samuel heard it. He did not react immediately. Instead, he brushed a crumb from his coat with a small, absent motion, then rested his hands again, fingers loosely interlocked, the posture of someone who had no intention of leaving but no desire to escalate either. "Like what?" he asked quietly. The question was simple, but it shifted something. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Brooks blinked once, the question landing where it was not expected, forcing a moment of internal recalibration. His eyes moved again, quick, scanning the space as if the answer might be found somewhere outside the man in front of him. A couple walking along the path slowed slightly, their conversation fading as they passed within earshot. A teenager sitting on the grass glanced up from his phone, curiosity flickering across his face before he quickly looked back down. The park had not stopped, but it had narrowed, the moment drawing attention without asking for it. Brooks straightened, grounding himself again in the authority he understood. "You are occupying the bench for too long," he said, choosing words that felt safer, more procedural, even if they rang hollow against the quiet reality of the scene. Samuel nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the sentence without agreeing to its meaning. His gaze drifted briefly toward the pond, where the light had shifted, the reflection now softer, less sharp than before. Time was passing. It always did. He had never tried to stop it. "I sit here," he said after a moment, his voice unchanged, still calm, still even, "because it is quiet." He paused, not for effect, but because that was how he spoke, allowing space between thoughts, letting them settle before continuing. "And because it reminds me to slow down." Brooks felt something tighten again, not outwardly, but beneath the surface, a tension that came from being met with something he could not easily push against. This was not refusal. Not exactly. It was presence. And presence, he was beginning to realize, could be harder to move than resistance. The breeze shifted once more, carrying a few loose leaves across the path, brushing lightly against Brooks's boot before continuing on. Samuel did not look at the officer now. He did not need to. He had said what he needed to say. And then, just as quietly as before, he reached for another piece of bread, breaking it carefully, letting it fall, continuing the small, steady rhythm that had brought him here in the first place, as if the moment around him, however tense, did not have the power to take that away. The air shifted before anything else did, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of change that does not come from movement but from pressure building beneath stillness. Officer Brooks drew in a slow breath, his chest rising under the firm structure of his uniform, and when he exhaled, something in his posture hardened, not louder, not aggressive, but more final, as if a decision had been made somewhere inside him that no longer left room for patience. "You are going to have to move," he said, and this time the sentence landed differently, not as a request framed in authority, but as a boundary set with expectation behind it. Samuel Carter did not respond right away. His hand hovered for a moment above the small paper bag, fingers paused mid-motion, then lowered slowly, resting again against his knee. The pigeons shifted closer, sensing the change in rhythm, their soft cooing filling the space where words had not yet followed. Samuel's gaze remained forward, not avoiding the officer, not engaging either, simply existing in the same calm line he had held since the beginning. Around them, the edges of the moment tightened. A woman walking her dog slowed just enough to glance over, her hand tightening slightly on the leash. Two men near the far bench stopped their conversation mid-sentence, their voices trailing off into a quiet that leaned toward attention. Brooks noticed all of it. He had been trained to notice. And with that awareness came something else, something sharper, the need to act before the moment slipped beyond his control. He took a small step forward, closing the distance by less than a foot, but enough to shift the balance of space between them. The gravel under his boot pressed down with a faint crunch, louder now in the compressed quiet. "Sir," he added, the word formal but firm. "This is your last warning." The phrase carried weight, not because of volume, but because of what it implied, the structure of consequence that stood just behind it. Samuel finally turned his head fully, meeting the officer's gaze without hesitation. His eyes were not challenging. They were clear. Steady. The kind of steady that came from a lifetime of knowing when to speak and when to simply stand, or in this case, remain seated. He studied the young man in front of him for a brief second, not as an authority figure, but as a person, as if looking for something beyond the uniform, beyond the badge that reflected the fading light. Then, slowly, Samuel shifted his weight, not to stand, but to reach down beside the bench. The movement was careful, deliberate, his hand finding the small brown bag again, folding the top neatly as if preparing to leave, though his body had not yet followed that intention. A few crumbs slipped from the edge, falling softly to the ground. One of the pigeons stepped forward immediately, pecking gently at the scattered pieces, unaware of the tension that now pressed against the air. Brooks watched the motion, his jaw tightening slightly, the controlled patience beginning to thin. He had expected resistance or compliance. What he had not expected was this quiet in between, this slow, deliberate pace that refused to match his urgency. "I am not asking again," he said, and though his voice remained measured, there was a clear edge now, a line drawn that expected to be respected. Samuel's hand paused on the folded bag. He looked down at it for a moment, then back up at the officer. The park seemed to hold its breath. Even the breeze that had been moving through the trees softened, as if the world itself had leaned in to see what would happen next. Samuel's lips parted slightly, not in haste, not in fear, but with the calm intention of someone who understood exactly where he stood and what it meant to remain there. The distance between them, though small, now carried the full weight of the moment, and in that space, tension settled in completely, quiet but undeniable, waiting for the next move to define everything that would follow. For a moment, nothing moved. Not the officer, not the man on the bench, not even the air between them. It was as if the park itself had stepped back, giving space to something quieter, something heavier than words. Samuel Carter lowered his gaze, not in submission, but in thought, his eyes settling on the ground just beyond his shoes where a few crumbs rested beside the faint outline of worn gravel. The pigeons had gathered again, their small bodies shifting in soft, rhythmic steps, pecking gently, unaware of the line drawn above them. Samuel watched them for a second, the corners of his expression softening just slightly, as if that simple, familiar motion grounded him in a way nothing else could. His fingers moved again, slow and steady, brushing lightly against his coat sleeve where the fabric had folded at the wrist. The edge of the medical bracelet slipped into view once more, catching a thin strand of sunlight that had broken through the branches overhead. The light lingered there, glinting faintly against the scratched metal, then faded as a cloud drifted across the sky. Samuel exhaled quietly, a breath so soft it barely disturbed the air, but enough to settle something within him. He had heard words like this before. Different voices, different uniforms, different places, but the same underlying message carried in tones that expected movement without question. He did not resist it with force. He never had. He met it with presence, with the quiet refusal to let urgency rewrite his pace. Behind him, the distant sound of water brushing against the edge of the pond continued its steady rhythm, a soft, continuous whisper that did not change no matter who stood nearby or what was said. A breeze moved through the trees again, slower now, lifting a few leaves and carrying them gently across the path. One drifted near Samuel's foot, settling beside the last piece of bread. He leaned forward slightly, not hurried, not tense, and picked it up, turning it once between his fingers before setting it aside on the bench beside him. A small, deliberate act. Careful. Controlled. Across from him, Brooks remained still, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer the firm, grounded posture of certainty. It carried weight now, the kind that came when a moment stretched longer than expected and did not resolve the way it was supposed to. His eyes flicked briefly to the man's hands, to the quiet precision in each movement, then back to his face, searching again for something that could justify the next step, something that would bring the situation back into the clear lines he understood. But the lines had blurred. Not dramatically. Not enough to name. Just enough to feel. Samuel lifted his head again, meeting the officer's gaze, and for a brief second, the noise of the park seemed to fall away entirely. No footsteps. No distant voices. Just the quiet space between two people standing on opposite sides of something neither of them could fully define. Samuel did not speak. He did not need to. His presence said enough. The calm in his posture, the steadiness in his eyes, the refusal to let the moment rush him forward or push him back. It held. It endured. And in that quiet, suspended breath of time, the tension shifted, not breaking, not resolving, but deepening, settling into a place where the next action would not just move the moment forward, but reveal something that had been waiting beneath it all along. The moment did not break with a shout or a sudden movement, but was something smaller, something almost easy to miss if you were not looking directly at it. Samuel Carter's sleeve shifted again as he adjusted his hand on the bench, and this time the medical bracelet slid fully into the light, no longer a passing glint but a clear, steady presence. The metal caught the sun in a way that made it impossible to ignore, its worn surface reflecting just enough brightness to draw the eye. Officer Brooks saw it. At first, it registered as nothing more than detail, another object in a scene already filled with too many things he could not fully control. But then his gaze lingered, just a fraction longer than before, and something about the engraving, faint but still visible beneath the scratches, pulled his focus in completely. He leaned forward slightly, not out of aggression, but instinct, the kind that comes when recognition begins to form before the mind has fully caught up. The letters were small, etched carefully into the metal, worn down at the edges but still legible. A name. Brooks's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in concentration, his breath catching just slightly as the shape of the letters aligned with something buried deeper than memory, something closer to familiarity. The world around them seemed to soften at the edges again, the distant sounds of the park fading into a low hum as his attention narrowed to that single detail. Samuel noticed the shift. He did not pull his sleeve down. He did not hide the bracelet. He simply let it remain where it was, resting against his wrist, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. A child's voice cut softly through the air from somewhere behind the path, light and unguarded. "Mom, look, that is the same kind of bracelet Dad had." The words were not directed at either of them, not meant to carry weight, but they did. They landed in the space between them and settled there. Brooks's posture changed almost imperceptibly, the rigid line of authority loosening just enough to let something else through. His eyes flicked from the bracelet to Samuel's face, searching now with a different kind of urgency, not for justification, but for confirmation. "Where? Did you get that?" he asked, and for the first time, the edge in his voice was gone, replaced by something quieter, something uncertain. Samuel held his gaze for a moment, then looked down at the bracelet as if seeing it through someone else's eyes. His fingers brushed lightly over the metal, tracing the worn engraving with a familiarity that came from years, not days. "It was not mine at first," he said softly. The words were simple, but they carried weight beneath them. He paused, just long enough for the silence to hold the space around the sentence. "It belonged to a man who needed it more than I did." Brooks felt something shift inside him, not sharp, not sudden, but deep, like a door opening slowly in a place he had not visited in a long time. The name on the bracelet echoed in his mind now, clearer, louder, impossible to ignore. He knew that name. Not as a stranger. Not as a coincidence. But as something tied to him in a way that made the air feel heavier in his chest. His hand, still resting near his belt, lowered slightly, the posture of control giving way to something else, something he had not expected to find here, standing in the middle of a quiet park on an ordinary afternoon. Samuel did not press the moment. He did not explain further. He simply sat, calm as before, allowing the truth to surface at its own pace. And in that quiet revelation, the balance between them shifted completely, no longer defined by authority and compliance, but by something far more personal, something that neither of them could step away from now that it had been seen. The name settled fully now, no longer a faint recognition but something solid, something undeniable, and Officer Brooks felt it move through him in a way that had nothing to do with training or protocol. His eyes dropped again to the bracelet, then lifted back to Samuel Carter, but this time the way he looked at him had changed. The authority was still there, the uniform had not disappeared, but it no longer led the moment. Something else had stepped forward, something quieter, something more human. "That name," Brooks said slowly, his voice no longer carrying the sharp edge from before. "It is Michael Brooks." He did not ask it as a question, even though doubt still lingered at the edges. Samuel gave a small nod, the kind that did not seek attention but confirmed truth without hesitation. "Yes," he replied, his tone unchanged, steady as it had been from the beginning. Brooks exhaled, longer this time, the breath leaving him in a way that felt heavier than it should have. His shoulders shifted, the rigid lines softening, and for the first time since he had stepped into this moment, he did not look like a man trying to control a situation. He looked like someone trying to understand it. "He is my father," Brooks said, the words landing carefully, each one measured, as if speaking them out loud made the connection more real than he was prepared for. The space between them changed again, not with tension now, but with something more complex, something layered with realization and something close to disbelief. Samuel studied him for a brief moment, not surprised, not shaken, just present in the way he always had been. "I figured," he said quietly. "You carry it in your face." Brooks blinked once, the comment catching him off guard, not because it was confrontational, but because it was gentle, almost familiar, as if Samuel had been observing him in ways he had not noticed. Brooks glanced away for a second, his gaze drifting toward the pond where the light had softened even more, the reflection now calm, almost still. "He told me once," Brooks continued, his voice lower now, less certain, "that someone stayed with him when things could have gone differently." He paused, searching his memory, piecing together fragments that had never felt complete until now. "He never gave a name. Just said there was a man who did not walk away." Samuel's hand moved again, resting lightly over the bracelet, his thumb brushing against the worn engraving as if acknowledging the memory that had lived there long before this moment. "He did not need to give my name," Samuel said. "He just needed to make it home." The simplicity of the sentence settled deeper than anything else that had been said. Brooks felt it in his chest, in the quiet space where certainty had once been. His hand dropped fully from his belt now, no longer anchored in authority, but hanging at his side, open, uncertain. He looked at Samuel again, really looked this time, not at the coat, not at the posture, not at the situation he thought he understood, but at the man himself. The one who had been here long before he arrived, sitting quietly, holding a piece of something that had once been part of his own life. Brooks's voice shifted again when he spoke, softer now, almost careful. "I did not know," he said. Samuel nodded once, a small motion, understanding without judgment. "You were not supposed to," he replied. "That is not why I stayed." The breeze moved through the park again, gentle, carrying the faint sound of leaves brushing together, and for a moment either of them spoke. The weight of what had been revealed settled into the space between them, not heavy in the way tension had been, but deep, grounded, impossible to ignore. And in that quiet, Brooks took a small step back, not out of retreat, but out of recognition, the first movement he had made that was not about control, but about respect. The park did not rush to fill the silence that followed. It simply continued, as it always had, steady and indifferent to the quiet shift that had just taken place. Officer Brooks stood still for a moment longer, the space he had stepped back into now feeling different beneath his feet, less like ground he controlled and more like ground he was learning to understand. His eyes lowered briefly, not in avoidance, but in reflection, the image of the bracelet, the name, the connection settling deeper with each passing second. The badge on his chest no longer felt like the center of the moment. It was just part of him now, not the whole of who he was standing there. Samuel Carter turned his attention back to the bench, to the small paper bag resting beside him, and unfolded it once more with the same careful motion as before. The rhythm returned quietly, naturally, as if it had only been paused, not broken. He took another piece of bread, broke it evenly, and let it fall to the ground. The pigeons responded again, stepping forward with soft, familiar movements, their presence unchanged by everything that had just passed between two men standing only a few feet apart. Brooks watched this for a moment, the simplicity of it settling into him in a way that felt unfamiliar but grounding. No urgency. No command. Just a man continuing something small and meaningful without asking permission to exist in that space. The breeze moved through the trees again, warmer now as the afternoon leaned closer to evening, carrying with it the quiet sounds of life returning to its normal rhythm. A jogger passed behind Brooks, footsteps steady, unbothered. The woman with the dog continued along the path, her pace no longer slowed. The moment had dissolved for them. But for Brooks, it remained, not as tension, but as something that would not easily leave. He shifted his weight once, then again, as if considering whether to say something more, whether there were words that could balance what had just been revealed. But none came easily. Instead, he gave a small nod, subtle, almost unnoticeable to anyone else, but intentional. It was not formal. It was not procedural. It was acknowledgement. Samuel noticed it without looking directly, the way he noticed most things, through presence rather than attention. He did not respond with words. He did not need to. His hands continued their slow, deliberate motion, breaking another piece of bread, letting it fall, maintaining the quiet rhythm that had outlasted the moment of tension and would continue long after it. Brooks turned slightly then, his body angling away from the bench, not in dismissal, but in acceptance that his place in this moment had changed. He took a step back onto the gravel path, the sound softer now, less defined than before. Another step followed, then another, each one carrying him away from the line he had drawn earlier, a line that no longer held meaning in the same way. He paused once more, just for a second, and glanced back, not at the bench, not at the situation, but at the man himself. Samuel Carter sat there, exactly as he had before, calm, steady, unshaken, the light catching gently along the edges of his coat and the bracelet resting quietly against his wrist. Then Brooks turned forward again and continued down the path, his figure gradually blending back into the movement of the park, no longer the center of anything. Behind him, the bench remained, the pigeons gathered, the soft sound of bread breaking and falling marking time in a way no clock ever could. The wind moved once more, lifting a few leaves into the air before letting them settle again, and in that quiet continuation, nothing needed to be said for the moment to be understood.